There's a trend going around on social media right now claiming that Squid Game was based on a real story. So let's explore the disturbing tale of the brothers' home. In the bustling port city of Busan, South Korea, during the late 20th century, there stood a facility that promised to serve as a beacon of hope for the nation's most vulnerable people. Known as the Brothers' Home, this government-sanctioned institution was initially intended to provide shelter and rehabilitation for the homeless, orphans, and those that are marginalized by rapid industrialization. Yet, behind its imposing gates, it concealed a horrific reality. Over the span of 12 years, it became a site of systematic abuse where forced labor, physical and sexual violence, and death were a part of daily life. From 1975 to 1987, over 38,000 people were detained at the brothers' home. Many of them were forcibly taken off the streets, labeled as vagrants, and incarcerated without trial or evidence of any wrongdoing whatsoever. The facility's purpose was clear: to sanitize urban spaces by erasing visible signs of poverty and disorder. For the government, it was a convenient solution to bolster South Korea's image of modernity. For those imprisoned, it was a living nightmare that stripped them of their dignity, humanity, and for many, their lives. So this is the story of the Brothers' Home, an institution that exploited the powerless, flourished under unchecked authority, and was aided by the silence of a society unwilling to confront its horrors. The Brothers' Home had its origins in the 1960s, a period marked by South Korea's rapid industrialization. While the nation experienced unprecedented economic growth, this transformation came at a cost. Rural communities were left behind, driving many to migrate to urban centers like Busan in search of better opportunities. The influx of migrants combined with the lack of affordable housing and social support systems led to a surge in the homelessness and street-dwelling populations. To address the growing issue, the Brothers' Home was founded as a welfare center aimed at providing shelter, food, and rehabilitation to those in need. Initially, it was a modest institution with a noble mission. However, by the mid-1970s, the facility's operations had shifted dramatically. South Korea's authoritarian government, led by President Chun Doo-hwan, launched a series of social purification campaigns aimed at eradicating visible poverty throughout the streets. These campaigns sought to remove so-called undesirables, homeless individuals, disabled people, orphans, and anyone deemed unfit for society from the streets. Ahead of major international events like the 1988 Seoul Olympics, these efforts intensified. The government wanted to project an image of progress and prosperity to the world, and visible signs of poverty did not align with that vision. Police were granted sweeping authority to detain anyone who appeared poor, disheveled, or lacked identification. Facilities like the Brothers' Home became the dumping grounds for those swept up in these campaigns. Under director Park In-gun, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but we're gonna hope that I am, the Brothers' Home evolved from a welfare center into a profit-driven institution. The government provided funding for every detainee housed at the facility, creating a perverse incentive to admit as many people as possible. Park capitalized on this system, turning detainees into unpaid laborers while siphoning off government subsidies for personal gain. For those who found themselves inside the Brothers' Home, it quickly became apparent that survival would be a daily battle. The facility, originally designed to house a few hundred people, routinely crammed over 4,000 detainees into its confines. Overcrowding created unsanitary and inhumane conditions, with detainees often forced to sleep on the floor or share cramped spaces with dozens of others. Yet, the overcrowding was merely the beginning of their suffering. One of the grueling aspects of life at the Brothers' Home was the forced labor imposed on detainees. The facility operated over 20 factories on site, producing goods such as textiles, furniture, and electronics. Detainees, regardless of age or physical condition, were required to work extremely long hours, often 14 to 16 hours a day, without any pay. Even children as young as 7 were forced to participate in this grueling labor. The work was relentless and unforgiving. Those who could not keep up with the pace were beaten or denied food as punishment. Injuries were common, ranging from cuts and bruises to more severe accidents caused by the unsafe machinery and working conditions. Medical care was almost non-existent. Detainees would become too injured or ill to work, often left to die. The profits generated from this labor flowed directly into the pockets of Director Park, while detainees toiled in misery. Park lived pretty comfortably, reaping the rewards of their exploitation. Physical violence was a constant reality for detainees at the brothers' home. Guards patrolled the facility with absolute authority, using beatings and other forms of physical punishment to maintain control. Even minor infractions such as speaking without permission or failing to complete a task could result in severe consequences. Beatings were often carried out in public as a form of humiliation and deterrence. Detainees were struck with wooden sticks and metal rods, or even fists, until they could no longer stand. One particularly brutal punishment involved forcing detainees to kneel on sharp gravel for extended periods of time. Those who collapsed from pain or exhaustion were beaten even further, leaving them bloodied and scarred for the rest of their lives. The physical abuse extended beyond routine punishments. Torture was used as a means of breaking detainees' spirits and instilling fear. Survivors recalled being forced into stress positions for hours or denied food and water for days at a time. The goal was clear: to strip the detainees of their will to resist and ensure their total subservience. But perhaps the most harrowing aspect of life at the brothers' home was the prevalence of SA. Children, particularly young boys and girls, were often the targets of this abuse. Guards and even senior detainees, who were granted authority over others, preyed on the most vulnerable people that were there. The abuse was systematic, carried out with impunity in an environment where victims had no means of seeking help or protection. For many of the survivors, the trauma of the sexual violence left deep psychological scars that persist to this day. The culture of fear and silence within the facility ensured that these crimes went unreported. Victims who attempted to speak out were often met with further violence, silencing them and perpetuating the cycle of abuse. One of the most heart-wrenching stories to emerge from the brothers' home is that of Jong Son, who was just 9 years old when his life would change forever. During a routine trip to Busan with his father and a younger sister, Han was approached by police as part of the government's social purification campaign. The officers accused the family of lacking proper identification, a common pretext used to detain individuals who fit their vague criteria of the undesirables. Despite his father's desperate pleas to release the children, the officers forcibly took Han and his sister into custody, leaving their father helpless and devastated. Upon arrival at the brothers' home, Han and his sister were immediately separated. This was a deliberate tactic often employed to disorient new detainees and eliminate any sense of familial or emotional support. Han was sent to the boys' home dormitory, a filthy, overcrowded space where children as young as 7 were crammed together. His sister, meanwhile, was taken to the girls' section of the facility, a place shrouded in misery and fear for Han. It was the last time he saw her. "I called for her, screamed her name," he later recounted in an interview, "but they hit me until I stopped. I didn't even know if she was alive." The conditions at the brothers' home were unforgiving. For the next 3 years, Han was forced into hard labor, often working 14 to 16 hours a day in the facility's factories, crafting furniture and other things. Despite his age, he was subjected to the same grueling workload as the adults. The labor was unpaid, and the only reward for completing his daily tasks was the avoidance of beatings. Though these were still a common occurrence, hunger was a constant companion. Meals consisted of scraps that barely sustained him, and the nights weren't very good either. He laid on the floor, unable to sleep, as the cries of others echoed through the night. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological scars ran even deeper. Han lived in constant fear, not only for his own survival, but the unknown fate of his sister. Decades later, Han would reveal that the uncertainty of her whereabouts haunted him more than the physical abuse that he endured. "Every day I thought about her," he said. "I wondered if she was still alive, if she was suffering like I was, or if something even worse had happened to her." Now in his 40s, Han continues to search for answers. Despite years of inquiries and investigators, the whereabouts of his sister remain unknown. "I carry her with me every day," he admitted. "I don't know if I'll ever find her, but I can't stop looking. It's the only thing that keeps me going." By the mid-1980s, fear of government retaliation ensured that few dared to speak openly about this. The authoritarian regime of President Chun Doo-hwan maintained a tight grip on information, and those who challenged the state's policies risked severe consequences. It wasn't until 1987 that the full extent of the horrors at the brothers' home was revealed, thanks to the bravery of a small group of detainees. Under the cover of darkness, a handful of detainees orchestrated a daring escape. Risking their lives, they navigated the facility's perimeter and fled into the city. Their destination was clear: local journalists who had previously expressed skepticism about the government's welfare programs. These journalists listened in horror as the escapees recounted stories of forced labor, physical and sexual abuse, and the unexplained deaths within the facility's walls. Armed with these first-hand testimonies, the reporters began to investigate further. Evidence uncovered was staggering. Records obtained from the brothers' home revealed that thousands of individuals had been detained illegally, many without any documentation or due process. Financial records exposed systematic embezzlement, with Director Park pocketing substantial sums of government funding intended for the care of the detainees. Even more shocking were the discoveries made on the property itself. Unmarked graves that suggested detainees who had died from the abuse or neglect were buried in secrecy to avoid scrutiny. The journalists' exposés ignited a public outcry, forcing the government to launch an official investigation. Prosecutor Kim Myung-won was appointed to lead the inquiry, and his findings corroborated much of what the escapees had reported. This was not just a failure of oversight, it was deliberate, systematic exploitation. Despite the overwhelming evidence, true justice for these victims of the brothers' home proved elusive. Director Park, the man who oversaw the facility and orchestrated much of its exploitation, was prosecuted in the wake of the investigation. However, the charges brought against him were limited to embezzlement, a stark contrast to the gravity of the abuses committed under his leadership. Park was convicted of siphoning government funds allocated for the welfare of the detainees and was sentenced to just 2.5 years in prison. For the survivors, the verdict was nothing short of a betrayal. While Park served his minimum sentence, the thousands of individuals who had suffered under his regime were left without closure or reparations. "They let him walk away from everything he did to us," one survivor said. "It felt like our lives didn't matter." Adding insult to injury, Park lived out the remainder of his life in comfort, never facing accountability for the human rights violations he oversaw. He died in 2016, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and unresolved trauma for the survivors of the brothers' home. The brothers' home is one of the dark chapters in South Korea's history, one that casts a dark shadow over the lives of its survivors. For decades, the government avoided acknowledging its role in enabling the atrocities that occurred there. Survivors, however, refused to let that story fade into obscurity. Through advocacy, interviews, and public campaigns, they worked tirelessly to keep the memory of what happened alive. In 2022, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission formally recognized the state's responsibility for the abuses at the brothers' home. The commission's report confirmed that the facility was part of the broader system of exploitation tied to the government's social purification policies. It called for a formal apology, financial reparations for survivors, and further investigations for those who facilitated the abuses. While the acknowledgement was a significant step forward, many survivors feel that justice remains incomplete. Reparations have been extremely slow to materialize, and the scars left by the brothers' home, both physical and emotional, continue to affect those who endured its horrors. For Jong Son and the countless others, the fight for recognition and closure is far from over. "The world needs to know what happened," Han said. "We can't undo the past, but we can make sure it's never forgotten." That's gonna do it for today's story. Do you think there's any resemblance between this and the Squid Games? I kinda understand it from the, it's in South Korea portion, and that there's obviously a lot of corruption with wealthy people and things of that nature. However, I don't think that it's as similar as everyone is saying that it is, mainly due to the fact that there weren't any games being played. However, some are currently claiming that the torture and abuse was called games. Now, while this may be possible, I personally couldn't find anything on it, so we're going to leave that out here. But the question still lingers. Is Squid Game something that happened in real life or not? You let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. I'm really glad to be back on YouTube, and I'm looking forward to making lots of new videos like this. If you enjoyed, make sure to subscribe and stick around, as we will have new videos coming out very soon. And don't forget to check out the Campfire Tales podcast over on Spotify, where you can find more stories and some that are even exclusive to the platform every week. That's going to be it for today. I'll see you in the next one.